Hello, my dears. Thank you all so very much for joining me today. So, today is another reading of Irish myth and folk tales. But before we begin, as per usual, let us create a nice, calming space of which to begin our reading. So, I shall light some incense. Once again, this is my favorite, the sandalwood. Hope I don't run out of it before I get more. And now, and with this, our readings continue. Our first story of the day is called The Corpse Watchers, attributed to Patrick Kennedy. There was once a poor woman that had 3 daughters, and one day the eldest said, "Mother, bake my cake and kill my cock, till I go see my fortune." So she did, and when all was ready, says her mother to her, "Which will you have? Half of these with my blessing, or the whole with my curse?" "Curse or no curse," says she, "the whole is little enough." So away she set, and if the mother didn't give her her curse, she didn't give her her blessing. She walked and she walked till she was tired and hungry, and when she sat down to take her dinner, while she was eating it, a poor woman came up and asked for a bit. "The dickens a bit you'll get from me," says she, "it's all too little for myself." And the poor woman walked away very sorrowful. At nightfall, she got lodging at the farmer's, and the woman of the house told her that she'd give her a spade full of gold and a shovel full of silver if she'd only sit up and watch her son's corpse that was walking in the next room. She said she'd do that, and so, when the family were in their bed, she sat by the fire and cast an eye from time to time on the corpse that was lying under the table. All at once the dead man got up in his shroud and stood before her, and said, "All alone, fair maid." She gave him no answer, and when he said it was the 3rd time, he struck her with a switch, and she became a gray flag. About a week after, the 2nd daughter went to seek her fortune, and she didn't care for her mother's blessing no more nor her sister, and the very same thing happened to her. She was left a gray flag by the side of the other. At last the youngest went off in search of the other 2, and she took care to carry her mother's blessing with her. She shared her dinner with the poor woman on the road, and she told her that she would watch over her. Well, she got lodgings at the same place as the others, and agreed to mind the corpse. She sat up by the fire with the dog and cat, and amused herself with some apples and nuts the mistress gave her. She thought it a pity that the man under the table was a corpse. He was so handsome. But at last he got up, and says he, "All alone, fair maid." And she wasn't long about an answer. "All alone I am not. I've little dog Douse, and Pussy, my cat. I've apples to roast, and nuts to crack, and all alone I am not." "Ho ho," says he, "you're a girl of courage, though you wouldn't have enough to follow me. I am now going to cross the quaking bog, and go through the burning forest. I must then enter the cave of terror, and climb the hill of glass, and drop from the top of it into the Dead Sea." "I'll follow you," says she, "for I engaged to mind you." He thought to prevent her that she was as stiff as he was stout. Out he sprang through the window, and she followed him till they came to the green hills. And then says he, "Open, open, green hills, and let the light of the green hills through." "Aye," says the girl, "and let the fair maid too." They opened, and the man and the woman passed through, and there they were, on the edge of a bog. He trod lightly over the shaky bits of moss and sod, and while she was thinking of how she'd get across, the old beggar appeared to her, but much nicer dressed, and touched her shoes with her stick, and the sole spread a foot out on each side. So she easily got over the shaky marsh. The burning wood was at the edge of the bog, and there was a good fairy flung a damp, thick cloak, and over her, and through the way the flame she went, and a hair of her head was not singed. Then they passed through the dark cavern of horrors, where she had heard the most horrible yells, only that the fairy stopped her ears with wax. She saw frightful things, with blue vapors round them, and felt the sharp rocks and the slimy backs of frogs and snakes. When they got out of the cavern, they were at the mountain of glass. And then the fairy made her slippers so sticky with the tap of her rod that she followed the young corpse easily to the top. There was a deep sea a quarter of a mile under them, and so the corpse says to her, "Go home to my mother, and tell her how far you came to do her bidding. Farewell." He sprung head foremost down into the sea, and after him she plunged, without stopping a moment to think about it. She was stupefied at first, but when they reached the waters, she recovered her thoughts. After piercing down a great depth, they saw a green light towards the bottom. At last they were below the sea. That seemed a green sky above them, and sitting on a beautiful meadow, she half asleep and her head resting against his side. But when she woke, she was in the bed at his house, and he and his mother sitting at her bedside, watching her. It was a witch that had a spite to the young man, because he wouldn't marry her, and so she got power to keep him in a state between life and death, till a young woman would rescue him by doing what she had just done. So, at her request, her sisters got their shape again, and were sent back to their mother with their spades of gold and shovels of silver. Maybe they were better after that, but I doubt it much. The youngest of them got the young gentleman for her husband. I'm sure she deserved him, and if they didn't live happy, that we may. Generally the roles are reversed, with a young man saving the damsel. It is quite interesting for the reverse. Assuming the young man was quite happy with her. Our next story for today is called The Witch of Rathdowney, and this story is attributed to an anonymous teller. It was about 80 years ago, in the month of May, that a Roman Catholic clergyman near Rathdowney, in the Queen's County, was awakened at midnight to attend a dying man in the distant part of the parish. The priest obeyed without a murmur, and having performed his duty to the expiring sinner, saw him depart this world before he left the cabin. As it was yet dark, the man who called on the priest offered to accompany him home, but he refused and set forward on the journey alone. He had not gone far when the grey dawn began to appear over the hills, and he amused himself in contemplating the varied lovely scenes presented to the intelligent observer by the splendid breaking of a May Day morning. The eastern sky was streaked with all the magnificent shades of crimson, vine, and gold, so peculiar to rosy May, and the brilliant morning star was shining as refulgently as if it had been created but that very hour. Everything was hushed in a calm response, except for the merry lark, as Shakespeare calls her, which poised high in the air amid the fleecy gold clouds, poured forth her matin hymn of praise and gratitude to the great author of the universe, or the wild, discordant cry of the heather bleat from the adjacent morasses, or the irregular pattering of the large dewdrops, as they fell like globules of liquid silver from the stirless trees at either side of the road. The good priest was highly enraptured with the beauty of this scene, and rode on, now gazing intently at every surrounding object, and again cutting with his whip at the bats and big beautiful night flies which flitted ever and anon from hedge to hedge across his lonely way. Thus engaged, he journeyed on slowly, until the nearer approach of sunrise began to render objects completely disconcertible, when he dismounted from his horse, and slipping his arm out in the rain, and drawing forth his bravery from his pocket, he commenced reading his morning office as he walked leisurely along. He had not proceeded very far when he observed his horse, a very spirited animal, endeavoring to stop at the road, and gazing intensely into the field on one side of the way where there were 3 or 4 cows grazing. However, he did not pay any particular attention to this circumstance, but went on a little further, when the horse suddenly lunged out with great violence, and endeavored to break free away by force. The priest with great difficulty succeeded in restraining him, and looking at him more closely, observed him shaking from head to foot, and sweating profusely. He now stood calmly, and refused to move from where he was, nor could any threats or entreaty induce him to proceed. The father was greatly surprised, but recollecting to have often heard of horses laboring under a fright, being induced to go by blindfolding them, he took out his handkerchief and tied it across its eyes. He then mounted, and, stroking him gently, he went forward without reluctance, but still sweating and trembling violently. They had not gone far when they arrived opposite to a narrow path or bridleway, and flanked at either side by a tall, thick hedge, which led from the high road to the field where the cows were grazing. The priest happened by chance to look into this lane, and saw a spectacle which made his blood curdle in his veins. It was the legs of a man from the hips downward, without a head or body, trotting up the avenue at a smart pace. The good father was very much alarmed, but, being a man of strong nerve, he resolved, come what might, to stand and be further acquainted with this singular spectre. He accordingly stood, and did so, and so did the headless apparition, as if afraid to approach him. The priest, observing this, pulled back a little from the entrance of the avenue, and the phantom again resumed its progress. It soon arrived on the road, and the priest now had sufficient opportunity to view it minutely. It wore yellow buckskin breeches, tightly fastened to the knee with green ribbon. It had neither shoes nor stockings on, and its legs were covered with long red hairs, and all full of wet blood and clay, apparently contracted in its progress through the thorny hedges. The priest, although very much alarmed, felt eager to examine the phantom, and for this purpose he determined to screw his courage to the sticking point, and now to summon all his philosophy to enable him to speak to it. The ghost was now a little ahead, pursuing its march at the usual brisk trot, and the priest urged on his horse speedily until he came up with it, and thus addressed it. "Hello, friend, who art thou, and whither art thou going so early?" The hideous spectre made no reply, but uttered a fierce or superhuman growl, or "Hm." "A fine morning for ghosts to wander about," again said the priest. Another "Hm" was the reply. "Why don't you speak?" "Hm, you don't seem very disposed to be very loquacious this morning." "Hm," again. The good man began to feel irritated with the obstinate silence of his unearthly visitor, and said with some warmth, "In the name of all that's sacred, I command you to answer me. Who art thou, or where art thou traveling?" Another "Hm," more loud and more angry than before, was the only reply. "Perhaps," said the father, "a taste of whipcord might render you a little more communicative." And so saying, he struck the apparition with a heavy blow with his whip on the breech. The phantom uttered a wild and unearthly yell, and fell forward on the road, and what was the priest's astonishment when he perceived the whole place running over with milk. He was struck dumb with amazement. The prostrate phantom still continued to eject vast quantities of milk from every part. The priest's head swam, his eyes got dizzy. A stupor came all over him for some minutes, and on his recovering, the frightful spectre had vanished, and in its stead he found stretched on the road, and half drowned in milk, the form of Sarah Kennedy, an old woman of the neighborhood, who had been long notorious in that district for her witchcraft and superstitious practices. And it was now discovered that she had, by infernal aid, assumed that monstrous shape, and was employed that morning in sucking the cows of the village. Had a volcano burst forth at her feet, he could not be more astonished. He gazed a while in silent amazement, the old woman groaning and writhing convulsively. "Sarah," says he at length, "I have long admonished you to repent of your evil ways, but you were deaf to my entreaties. And now, wretched woman, you are surprised in the midst of your crime." "Oh, father, father," shouted the unfortunate woman, "can you do nothing to save me? I am lost. Hell is open for me, and legions of devils surround me this moment, waiting to carry my soul to perdition." The priest had not the power to reply. The old wretch's pains increased. Her body swelled to an immense size. Her eyes flashed as if in fire. Her face was black as night. Her entire form writhed in 1,000 different contortions. Her outcries were appalling. Her lace sunk, her eyes closed, and in a few minutes she expired in the most exquisite tortures. The priest departed homewards, and called at the next cabin to give notice of the strange circumstance. The remains of Sarah Kennedy were removed to her cabin, situated at the edge of a small wood at a little distance. She had long been resident to the neighborhood, but she still was a stranger, and come there no one knew from where. She had no relation in that country but one daughter, now advanced in years, who resided with her. She kept one cow, but sold more butter, it was said, than any farmer in the parish, and it was generally suspected that she acquired it by devilish agency, as she never made me a secret of being intimately acquainted with sorcery and fairyisms. She professed the Roman Catholic religion, but never complied with the practices enjoined by that church, and her remains were denied Christian sepulture, and were buried in the sand pit near her own cabin. On the evening of her burial, the villagers assembled and burned her cabin to the earth. Her daughter made her escape, and never after returned. I cannot help but consider the priest having failed him, for it was his job to try and help the woman who was being tortured as she begged for safety, and yet he just allowed it. And the villagers burning the home with the daughter. I'm glad she was able to find a way out. But in the end, it wasn't their home, and the witch was already dead. But oh well. Alright. Now, normally I would continue on for another 30 minutes. However, that was the last story of the section of witches and fairy doctors. And so, for the next reading, we will actually begin the section over Tir na Nog. So, without much more further ado, we will call it a day. I do thank you all so much for joining me today. And please do let me know how you enjoyed this difference in visuals. I thought it quite beautiful. But if it is far too distracting for you, please let me know. But until next time, my dears, I do hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day. And until we next meet, my dears, ta-ta, and fare thee well. Thank you for making it to the end of the video. If you like what you saw here, I ask that you leave a like, comment, subscribe, and until we next meet, my dears, I do hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day. And until then, ta-ta and farewell.